Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Lantz. I'm here on behalf of the Schiller Institute and LaRouche organizations and LaRouche PAC. And what we're going to be going through today, besides a quick overview of the strategic situation, is we're going to be at least touching on some of the aspects of the new report by Jason Ross, The Future Platform of U.S. Infrastructure, Case Study, New York City. In other words, we're going to look at what an actual infrastructure program, moving dirt, digging a lot of dirt, would look like. And that's going to move to the center of our presentation today, my presentation, drawing on Jason Ross's paper, and then the discussion can follow. So I thank you for being here, and I thank the people watching this from home or their office. This is the 10th of June. All right, so we've been reporting on the breakthroughs that have been coming fast and furious. We had the Belt and Road Forum, May 14th and 15th, with Helga Zepp-LaRouche as an invited guest, as an invited speaker, and a multitude of further agreements of consolidation of the entire Belt and Road Initiative is growing out of that. 130 nations were present, 29 heads of state, and enough said on that just by way of summary. We then had the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which in Russia, St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, and we had a delegation of 300 Americans, businessmen largely, the U.S. ambassador as well, a complete reversal of the Obama war with Russia and China policy, which had held sway up until the election of President Donald Trump. And now we've had, just this last weekend, we have in Astana, Kazakhstan, the capital of Kazakhstan, we have the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, largely a security organization. And what's new in that is that India and China have joined that. So this now encompasses, I'll just rattle them off really quick: Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, China, Kazakhstan, Russia, India, and Pakistan. And among the observers, official observers, is the nation of Afghanistan, as well as Iran, Belarus, and Mongolia. So the SCO, this is extremely important. Just going back to the Belt and Road Forum, just this week, Prime Minister Abe of Japan endorsed the Belt and Road Forum. This had been one of those sticking points which the Western media was reporting on, has been on and off reporting on for the last few years, how Japan rightfully was not trusting the Chinese and was sticking with Obama in opposition to the Belt and Road Initiative and to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Well, now Abe has officially endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative. That's been praised from China. That's moving forward. Well, at the SCO, India and Pakistan both joining the SCO was remarkable. Again, these are countries that the British and the blimps, the British liberal imperialists on both sides of the Atlantic, have tried to play off against each other for 100 years at least. What became Pakistan as opposed to India, playing these two countries, what are now countries, off against each other. At the SCO as well, President Sharif and President Modi of Pakistan and India met informally, conversation and so forth. They haven't met in a few years. So again, the attempts to say, oh, well, you know, there's these overriding differences and so on and so, well, they're being superseded. The SCO conference, from the reports that we have so far, was very much focused on the war against terrorism and figuring out a way, with the increasing role of the SCO countries, of drying out Afghanistan, solving the Afghan running sore that's been in process since the 1990s. So, so that's all moving the whole process forward. Now, we're out to get the United States into the Belt and Road Initiative, to make it into a world land bridge, a world network of rail, high-speed rail, but also connectivity in all forms. And the spearhead of this, in terms of U.S. infrastructure, is the rebuilding of the infrastructure of the New York metropolitan region. And therefore, this case study, as Jason Ross termed it, that's just been published. This is the idea here is as a spearhead for the revival of the infrastructure of the entire nation. Now, you know, it was posed by our colleague Dennis Speed up in New York. The hypothetical: what if John F. Kennedy was there with Helga Zepp LaRouche at the Belt and Road Forum? What would have been the outcome? What would have been the policies initiated upon JFK's return to Washington, D.C.? And I think that's posing it in the right way, because what we're talking about here is a national mission, a return to a national mission, which our country has not had, really, since John F. Kennedy. Just hasn't existed. Think of the space program. That was our national mission. That defined a national mission for a nation. And so this question of a return to a national mission, you don't go into outer space in virtual reality. You may think you're in outer space in virtual reality, but you don't go into outer space without physical science and physical economy and advancing those areas of knowledge. And you don't rebuild the infrastructure of New York in virtual reality. You've got to move dirt. You've got to grind rock. You've got to blast your way underground. It's dirty work. It's physical work, and driven with science, driven with knowledge, but it's transforming the so-called nature. Actually, in fact, building, as we've talked about, a higher level of a higher platform, a synthetic environment, a higher platform of infrastructure. And that's a mission. That's the kind of broad, this shift back from the post-industrial, you know, airy-fairy green age to a pro-growth, pro-science, we can do it mode. That's what we're talking about. That's what's underway around the world. It's a matter of us getting on board. Now, this is why we need to crush this FBI fraud, this coup attempt underway against President Trump. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on details here. We're finding in New York City, where we have numbers of teams out every day, that there's a tremendous amount of anger and resentment over the treatment of President Trump and the treatment of the American people by this endless barrage of noise. This last week, it was this creature, Comey, testifying before the Congress, and let me just cite Alan Dershowitz, the constitutional specialist on constitutional law, Harvard University, professor emeritus. He's been on the news. He's making the point. He was 100% for Hillary, but his point is that Comey, I'm quoting him, Comey confirmed that under the Constitution, the president has the authority to direct the FBI to stop the investigation of any individual. And that president after president has done exactly that, starting with Adams through Lincoln, through the presidents, through Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and the first Bush administration. Now, Adams has cited that's before the FBI was around. Likewise, Lincoln. But the point is, the president directs the Department of Justice, as well as, and the FBI is now part of the Department of Justice. It was created under the Department of Justice. They are part of a unified executive branch of government, and they work under the president. They serve the president. So just that in itself should give away to a lot of people, most people, thinking people, that the completely fallacious nature of this media debate about Trump, and was there or was there not obstruction of government of justice, when the president said to or allegedly said to Comey, I expect your loyalty, and otherwise said, I hope you can let this go with General Flynn, Michael Flynn. Was that or was not obstruction of justice? Absolutely not. From the standpoint of the Constitution, absolutely not. Whatever you want to interpret that back and forth, alleged back and forth, because you can't trust an FBI director. They're liars. They're all liars. It's a matter of record. Look at J. Edgar Hoover and look at the rest of them. And on Comey, we should just remind our fellow citizens that Comey was the guy sitting at the head of the FBI who covered up the 28 pages on 9/11, who covered up the Saudi roll. That's part of what Comey is. And Comey, before that, was the individual who headed up, via the Justice Department, the prosecution of Lyndon LaRouche in Boston, Massachusetts, which failed, but nonetheless, he was the head of the Get LaRouche Task Force. That's who Comey is. So this guy is a snake. So to have him paraded before the U.S. Congress, you know, as if this was a great individual speaking the truth and so on and so forth, is delusional, because in fact his record is there for anyone to look at in terms of what this guy is. So I would just add that President Putin in Russia had warned that this was a Maidan when Trump came into office, that there was an ongoing operation, a coup, a colored revolution being attempted, just as had been orchestrated from the precincts of London and Washington, D.C., in carrying out a coup in Kiev, the Maidan so-called coup in Ukraine. And I should add further, it's been Lyndon LaRouche who has specifically identified the British as the ultimate author of this operation against Trump. The role of Christopher Steele, MI6, who authored the so-called sexy dossier on Trump, completely fraudulent, that Comey tried to use to blackmail Trump with in his January meeting with Trump. The role of GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters, the equivalent of the NSA. It's named such so that you can hardly remember the name, you know, to try to make it seem like there's no there, but it's the GCHQ, in fact, shopped fake intelligence into the U.S. intelligence community as part of the operation to set in motion the effort to bring down Trump and Trump's team. So that's some of the background, and it's the British Empire, which very much exists financially in terms of raw materials, the Commonwealth nations and so forth, that has the most to lose from US, Russia, China cooperation. All right, now we have also some very positive developments in the United States, besides the fact that Comey's actually in certain ways making a fool of himself, and that's being pointed out. The Russian charges of connivance with Russian intelligence are falling by the wayside in the process of all this. But in addition, we have the revived fight, an expanded fight for Glass-Steagall, taking place in the Congress. We had Walter Jones, Congressman Walter Jones, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur leading an effort in the Rules Committee, Marcy Kaptur testifying at length. on the necessity of Glass-Steagall and proposing it be substituted for the content of H.R. 10, the Hensarling bill. And then you had Capter and Tulsi Gabbard, both speaking from the floor of the House on the 9th, Thursday the 9th, or Friday the 9th, I guess it was, to the same effect for Glass-Steagall enactment. And there's going to be more hearings. There's going to be special conferencing and so forth going on. There is a real initiative going on around this. So I just want to bring that to everyone's attention. H.R. 790 is the House bill for Glass-Steagall. Now we had President Trump speaking on infrastructure over the course of this week. What's been declared Infrastructure Week, really more than a week, it's almost 2 weeks long. But he spoke on Friday at the Department of Transportation. He's on Wednesday, he was at the Ohio River in Cincinnati, and speaking to the need to rebuild the 12,000 miles of waterways, the waterway system of the United States, the inland artery, as he said, arteries of the United States transportation system. And he cited DeWitt Clinton, the man responsible for building the Erie Canal. You can put up that first slide. Built actually in 2 years, 400 miles, 2 years it was built. That's the kind of thing, as President Trump indicated, that we need to do again. It was called Clinton's Ditch at the time. President Trump cited the fact that President Jefferson, had declared the idea of building the Erie Canal madness, and said that if you tell a New Yorker it can't be done, well, they'll get it done, and that's what DeWitt Clinton and his team did. He was the governor, well, at the time he was the head of the Canal Commission, but he became the governor of New York shortly thereafter, really in 1825, at the time that the canal was being finished. So there's a spirit that, look, we've got to turn the corner on this. We've got an infrastructure system, you can't even call it a system anymore, fragments of a system that are disintegrating, and a lot has to be done to address this. So let's turn quickly now to the main substance of our discussion here. Again, drawing from Jason Ross's new report, A Future Platform of U.S. Infrastructure Case Study for New York City. This is available already. I'm sure it'll be more broadly available. It's already available on the LaRouche PAC website. It's the first or second item down if you go to LaRouchePAC.com, and you'll see you'll see Jason Ross, and you'll see it indicated where you can click to get a PDF of this report, to call up a PDF on your computer. Click it and be patient, because it's a fairly lengthy document, and it just takes a while to load, but it's there. So I really urge people to go and dig into that for themselves. One of the points that Jason makes early on, just to kind of set the stage here, he makes the point that that the value of the steam engine, the value of steam locomotives, steam-powered locomotives, the effect of that on the nation cannot be measured in terms of the savings on freight charges or the reduced expenses of coal for steam engines compared to paying for oats for horses. Okay? That's not, just think about it historically, what the effect of building out rail across the United States was in terms of transforming the entire continent. It was a moonshot. I think Jason's point is well taken, extremely well taken, that you cannot look, and this is part of the problem we have in recent years, is we look at infrastructure piecemeal. What do we have as the next slide, Mike?
I'm having a problem.
Oh, you're having a problem there. Okay, our infrastructure is not so great here. Okay, so we'll roll on here. But you can't look at infrastructure piecemeal. You have an agency. I'll see if I can find the name of it. Yeah, the Highway Trust Fund. Well, that's one aspect of it. But the Federal Transit Administration, FTA. The FTA has a couple of $1 billion a year, $2 billion roughly, that it gives out for big infrastructure projects. But for that infrastructure project to be authorized, your infrastructure project to be authorized, well, you've got to prove what the benefits are going to be from that project, right? Before you even begin. Essentially, it's another name for the same kind of process is cost-benefit analysis, right? You have to prove in advance what the outcomes are going to be of what you're doing. We would have never got to the moon that way, right? You would have never built the Transcontinental Railroad that way. And you can the Erie Canal. I mean, this is Jefferson saying it was madness to even conceive of the Erie Canal. It's the same mentality. You have to prove ridership estimates. You have to prove. You have to hypothetically consider alternatives. Well, like not building it. What would happen if you didn't build it at all? Well, there'd be pastures, there'd be whatever. I mean, the cows would be happy, contented cows or something. I mean, this is the lunacy. Trump at one of these meetings, I think it was in Washington, you might have read about it. He held up 70 pounds in 3 binders of the paperwork that was done for the construction of a short piece, I think it was 10 miles, maybe it was a little more, 20 miles, of highway in Maryland. 70 pounds worth of paper. The cost came out to $25,000 a page. Right? Now, 1.9 or 2 or 3 billion dollars isn't going to build much anyway. But then another feature of the process is you've got to get local joint funding, right? They expect matching funds to be put up by local government. Well, you can imagine the process becomes more and more complicated, and a single naysayer, a single budget hawk, can kill an entire program, right? Or stall it at least, but can kill it, right? Somewhere along the line. If the local government suddenly pulls out because they don't have a majority on the city council anymore or something like that.
They're broke.
Or they're broke, yes. If they're broke, yep. So the piecemeal nature of making decisions about infrastructure and judging what is of value in terms of infrastructure is what's got to be thrown out. So you look at China. How are we doing there, Mike? Are we still?
Well,
I'm just checking here on the slides.
Yeah, well, I have the slides, but I'm not able to put them out.
Mike's still having trouble. That's the upshot of it. Okay, moving on. So
we're
compare.
Going to present the slides here, just locally here, and stick this. So you can open that up.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure. Okay. Well, here's the Erie Canal.
All right.
We've already seen that.
Let me just move this over a little.
Okay. All right. This is a little chaotic here. I think this is
chaotic.
Mike's improvisation here.
Improvisation.
Okay, I'm now off screen. This is a deliberate.
No, you're on the screen.
This is a deliberate calculation on Mike's part. So move on. Let's move on to the next. So there's the Erie Canal, right from the Hudson River. We're going to be coming back to the Hudson River, all the way out to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Go ahead. So that's 1823, 1825. 2 years to build it. Here's the expansion of U.S. rail. The green is by 1850. The red is by 1861. So this is the rapid expansion of rail transport in the United States. By comparison, we now have half the rail that we had in 1970 in the United States. The amount of rail has been cut in half. So compare this, I'm not sure what the next one is. Oh, yeah, here you go. Here's, in terms of talking about piecemeal. This is a map of proposed investments in high-speed rail. It does not include the Houston to Fort Worth stretch, but you get the picture here. It's a little here, a little there, so forth and so on. It's not a national plan. This is the kind of stuff that's been kicking around. You know, a few $1 billion were put up in 2010 under the Obama administration to finance high-speed rail, you know, and it all just went for paperwork. You know, it's just, you know, non-existent. Move on. Okay, well, we can hold on here. This is where we're going next. But first, let me just speak a little bit about China. Most of you know this, but it really just has to be underscored by comparison. And China is thinking like John F. Kennedy. You know, that's one way of conceiving of it. China, as a country, thinks like America did in the 1960s under John F. Kennedy. They've lifted 700, 800, maybe even 900 million people now out of poverty. And this is over a period of 30 plus years. Since 1998, in 1998, they decided to build what they called a modern, comprehensive transportation system utilizing different transportation modes. And so they proceeded to build out 22,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, subway systems. They've gone from 3 to 40 cities with integrated subway systems, integrated into ground transport, integrated with high-speed rail. I mean, this is the integration of many modes of transport. That's one thing I think often gets missed. People talk about China's high-speed rail. There's a reason for doing that, for emphasizing it. But their intention was to build out an integrated transport system, which included riverways, ports, everything right down to bicycles. You know, free bicycles. You know, that you can pick up at the railroad stations and so forth to get, or from the subways to get to where you got to go to work. And of course, they have maglev coming online. It's already online in Shanghai, in Changsha, and later this year in Beijing. An extension in Beijing is going maglev. So then look at, in terms of energy consumption, it's increased 5-fold in 25 years. Energy consumption, electricity consumption has increased 25-fold in 20 years. Now that's an enormous increase in the per capita power to do work, to accomplish work. Whether you're on an industrial site or at your home, the point is you have a much increased capability to accomplish the work that has to be done. U.S. energy consumption, by comparison, has been falling since 2010. The rate of growth began to drop back in 1994, both for energy consumption and electricity consumption. And it's now gone negative in terms of, you know, we have a falling consumption rate of electricity in the country. That's not a matter of simply consumption, personal consumption. That's a problem with these terms. Consumption by itself has a misleading kind of connotation these days. But for production. So that's all happening. Now, we have the Trump budget. It's not a happy thing. He's proposing cuts in the highway trust fund outlays, various other things. I shouldn't say he, it's in the budget. It's not going to be passed as it is. And who knows what President Trump actually is thinking, because he's simultaneously making these speeches, as he did in Cincinnati, Ohio, calling for a massive upgrade in infrastructure. All right? So I think one way of thinking about that, just briefly, without dwelling on it right now, is just to think, well, what is going to be done off budget? What is going to be done otherwise? You know, just set aside the idea of the budget. The entire Iraq war under Shrub Bush, W. Bush, was financed off the budget. It ran up the deficit. It was very real expenses, but it was off the budget. That's not the kind of off the budget we want to do. But if you create a national infrastructure bank and you draw in the funds from China, from Japan that are being offered, and the more that could come, and other government agencies could put in capital and so on and so forth. The point is that you could, through a national infrastructure bank or a national bank, you could multiply the amount of resources available to build infrastructure. And if you plug in tax revenues, you can do it even more. If there's a certain tax revenue base that's devoted to, in the future, to the national bank, then your capabilities can be increased even further. So, I think it would be wrong to fixate on, in any way, what's being proposed right now as a budget coming out, of this conflicted administration that's in the middle of a coup attempt, and say, well, it's this or that. This is something we have to shape. So now, in terms of New York, Lyndon LaRouche, economist statesman, proposed back in late May the formation of a committee on Manhattan infrastructure. And that's in process. And Dennis is, Jason Ross's paper is a contribution to that effort. Now, what was the context for that? Well, on April 14th of 2017, 1,200 passengers were stuck in the Hudson River, right, when their train stopped running. That was on April 14th. And if you, here's a couple of articles. I have one copy of the article on those stuck under the Hudson River. On May 30th, the Long Island Railroad, one of its trains, got stuck under the East River because of a power malfunction on this, what's called the third rail that provides electricity to the trains. The power went out. This is now common. I mean, there are thousands of delays in the train systems. Please pass these on. Somebody here? Okay. There's also maps there. I'd like to pass those maps around for people that are here. They're simple maps. Now, these breakdowns are just the latest feature. Oh, here's a few more of this one. Excuse me. Yep. Okay. You had in the backdrop of this, you had Hurricane Sandy, right? And Hurricane Sandy in 2012 wreaked havoc, flooding the transportation tunnels, the railroad tunnels, and so forth and so on throughout New York City. And so as a consequence of this, but a consequence of something much more substantial, you now have what Governor Cuomo and others have been calling the summer of hell that's coming up for those in New York City. We have here on the map, just to refresh your memories, this is the mid-Atlantic region of the East Coast. You see New Jersey. Above that, you see New York in the green. Pennsylvania is off to the left, and of course, Philadelphia is on the eastern end of Pennsylvania. And of course, going on down, you're going through Maryland, and of course, Washington, D.C. All is one stroke. Go ahead to the next one. And this is the Northeast Corridor high-speed rail proposal that aims to straighten out the routes to allow for high-speed rail. There's different things that are being discussed. But these projects, go ahead to the next one, are not going to happen unless we solve the problems in this nexus of New York City itself. The New York City population, or Manhattan in particular, doubles from 1.6 million to 3.1 million or more on a daily basis. And that's the population you have to move. Now can you go on to the next one? Let's see. And the next one. And go back. Go the next one. There we go. Okay. Now, I just want to give, first of all, just in terms of geography, you see here, what you're seeing here in front of you is Long Island. and it's long. It's the longest island. It's the biggest island in the contiguous 48 states. All right, down at the lower left-hand corner, you see Brooklyn and Queens. That they're part of Long Island, and then it stretches on further out. Then they're part of New York City proper. Then in the red to the far left, you see Manhattan. It's a tiny strip running north-south. And then above that in the blue is the Bronx. So this is, a lot of people, some people here are from that neck of the woods, so to speak. Most of us are not. So I just wanted to familiarize this this geography, so we're all on the same page. Go back to the last one now. Now, at the center of this whole business is, first of all, Penn Central Station. 600,000 commuters, passengers a day, Amtrak, commuter rail, and so on and so forth. It's completely underground. It's under Madison Square Garden. At one time, it was above ground. And now there's future projects coming into it. The second major terminal you've heard of, and the two are confused sometimes, is the Grand Central Terminal. And both of those are located at the center of the map. Penn Central Station is named there. You see it right here. And Grand Central Station here. And this whole nexus of roads, this is what goes out to Long Island. Right? I mean, keep in mind, Long Island is not separate. It's part of New York. These are going north, you're going into Westchester County, you're going on up into Connecticut. East over here is New Jersey, and you have over 300,000 people a day coming in from New Jersey. You have about 330,000 people a day coming in from Long Island, and others coming in from Queens and Bronx and what am I leaving out? Brooklyn, coming into Manhattan as well. All right, and Grand Central Station is really kind of the metro hub for the subways as well as buses for MTA, Metropolitan Transit Authority, and for the train stations going north. That's a little bit of background on that. Go on to the next, and go on to the next. This is just how connected all of this is by tunnels and bridges. This is just the Metropolitan Transit Authority bridges and tunnels. This is part of a problem you're dealing with. You have the New York Department of Transportation, DOT. You have the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which is the domestic, the internal subway system and so forth. You have the New Jersey Transit. You have Long Island Railroad, which is owned by MTA. You have Metro North Railroad. You have Amtrak, and Grand Central Station is a privately owned company. Go ahead, talk about piecemeal. Here's Grand Central Station, 21 lanes. Now they're going to have to start because
Grand Central or Pennsylvania?
Penn Central. Did I say Grand Central?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Pennsylvania Station. All right, 21 lanes across.
Sure.
Okay, this summer they're going to start shutting down more or less immediately. They'll be shutting down 3 lanes at a time of these rails. 3 at a time will be shut down for repairs. They've been having derailments. I've mentioned a couple of this in terms of the Long Island Railroad, the tunnels under the Hudson, but in Penn Central itself, you're having derailments. One of them took out 4 lanes. A train doesn't just derail, it sprawls out, right? And took out 4 lanes. You got to close down 3 lanes at a time because you got to repair a lane, but at the same time, you got to move stuff in to repair it with. And you got to move the junk out, that you're getting rid of, right? So you got to close 3 lanes at a time. So this means that Pennsylvania Station, and particularly the trains running in from Long Island, which come into Pennsylvania Station, the capability for the throughput of passengers is going to be substantially reduced, by 25% or more. All right. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people having to find other ways of getting in to Manhattan, into the city, and from there getting to wherever they got to get by subway and so on and so forth. So this is some of what you're dealing with. Now this is the, this is.
How many people?
I'm sorry?
How many people did you say are getting?
Well, there's about 600,000 people plus that come through Pennsylvania Station in a day. They're coming in from both sides.
You said it's reduced by 25%, so.
Roughly, something like a 20-25% reduction in the throughput as a result of these closings of 3 lanes at a time as they attempt to patch together the Penn Central Station.
Try to drive in on their cars.
Yeah. Somebody was, I think it was Jason was saying, sure, people can take Uber. It's proposed that people can take Uber. Well, then you can sit on the bridge trying to get into the city in the clogged freeways with all the other people who are trying to reroute from trains onto 4-wheeled vehicles, right?
Maybe you should walk.
Yeah, you should walk. Go on to the next one. This is the New York City Penn Station as it now appears. This kind of thing. It's, as I said, underground. Go ahead to the next. This is Grand Central Station, just so you kind of get the two separated in your minds. And then all of its rails are underground as well. Go on to the next. And now you have this major project. I mean, there's projects going on. There's now what's called East Side Access Project. You see it up in their upper right-hand corner here. Primarily for the Long Island Railroad. To come in underground, underneath the existing underground systems. So they're now, this has been ongoing for 10 years now. They're boring through underground, 14 floors down.
Wow.
Equivalent to 14 floors below ground. Go on to the next. This gives you a sense of this. Go on to the next. And in terms of the size of those holes, what's being drilled. Right, to come in. So this is a project which actually was hoped to have been completed by now, but they're 10 years behind. I mean, they ran into real problems, physical problems. You gotta move dirt. It's not easy. But it's also, it's a question of funding, resources. The Chinese would have gotten it done on time. And they wouldn't have done it with coolie labor. I mean, they would have done it high tech and they would have gotten the job done. They would have put the resources in that were required to get it done. But nonetheless, the other flaw though, well, this is nice, but if you can't get people in from Long Island under the East River into the Central Station, they're trying to move Long Island, at least half of the traffic from Penn Central up to this new facility underneath or part of Grand Central, right? Who cares what you got in Grand Central if you can't get them through the tunnels, right? Go on to the next. This is another project. This is Dan brought that to our attention. The new, I think it's Goethals to Staten Island from Elizabeth, New Jersey. What you see there on the far left is the old bridge. In one direction is completed there, and in the middle is the other going the other direction, which will be built out and completed by next year, sometime next year. Go on to the next. That's just gives you a sense of the system. But here's what I'm talking about. This is the so-called East River. I mean, that's the name of it, the East River, right? And goes up to Long Island Sound, right? East River. Over here is the Hudson River, right? And this is just Manhattan. This is not New York City. This is just Manhattan. Here's all, this just gives you a sense. These are all the tunnels and bridges and so forth that connect Long Island, Queens, and Brooklyn and so on and so forth into Manhattan. And these are what flooded out in Hurricane Sandy. There's 11 subway tunnels that serve the subway system, not including the vehicle traffic bridges. 9 of them flooded, and there's tremendous damage from this. It's salt water, but it's chloride, So, you know, a lot of other stuff. And it completely, you know, wreaked havoc with the electrical systems and signaling systems and all that's involved, not just power, but signaling and so forth, on all of these tunnels. So they're being patched together, held together, and the major ones are over 100 years old, these tunnels. Go on to the next. That's an example of the flooding of one of the tunnels. I think that's one of the what's called the East River tunnels, under the obviously under the East River, flooding from Hurricane Sandy. Go on to the next. This is from the New York Times. This is just an indication of some of the routes and of some of these tunnels that were flooded out, highlighted there. I don't think it's worth going through the details of it. The damage is what's major. Go on to the next. And that's just getting, you know, that was the reading from Metropolitan Transit Authority, you know, on the day after Hurricane Sandy hit. You know, everything, Long Island Railroad's all suspended. You know, the Metro North Railroad's almost all suspended. Everything's suspended in terms of the subways there on the left, just to get, you know, just to make sure you have a sense of how catastrophic this was. But again, we're dealing with infrastructure that's ancient, you know, and overloaded. 100-year-old tunnels completed in 1905, 1910, the East River tunnels and so forth. Penn Central, not that old, but it's at 600,000 people. It has double the number of people going through it that it was built to handle. Go on. Okay, this is just an example. This is one of the East River tunnels. It's a set of 4 of them. You know, you just get an idea of the condition of these things just looking at that. Go on to the next. Now here's the routes out into Long Island. So just to give you a sense, I mean, Brooklyn, Queens, but then on out through through all of Long Island. That's what comes to a halt. All of that transportation, so much of it going in and out of Manhattan, is what comes to a halt when those tunnels break down. As I handed out a handout there on that breakdown, you know, people trapped in the tunnel, you know, one of those train breakdowns, right? That's happened since Hurricane Sandy. Those are happening all the time. Or delays or this or that and so on and so forth. Okay. Just go on to that subway system. Okay. So this is one of them that's, besides the breakdown of the East River tunnels, what's been declared is the other major train running out into Long Island, to Brooklyn, Queens, and on, is the L train. And they're going to close that for 15 months, beginning in 2019. That's already been announced. The contract's been let out because it's completely breaking down. What you see here, Williamsburg Bridge. This is the option. They're proposing to create an HOV lane in the middle of Williamsburg's bridge. Go on to the next. I think I have a picture. That's the Williamsburg Bridge.
Oh, yeah.
All right. I mean, it's already got a little train running on top of it. That's another train. But that's they're going to try to create an HOV lane, you know, out of this thing, in the middle of this thing. Yeah. You know, this is so you have this accumulated set of, you know, of overloaded, breaking down infrastructure. You know, you can imagine the buck pass that goes on, you know, between the governor and the mayor and the this and the that and the whatever, and it really is not that important to the whole process in terms of solving it. Go on to the next. This is the Long Island Railroad. This is what they look like. Go on to the next. That's Third Rail, the Long Island Railroad. This is from the coming down. I think this is a New Haven train. Anyway, it's coming down from the north. It's electrified above with catenary wires, right? What they call catenary wire, electrified wires overhead, right? The systems don't even mesh, as many of you know from reading some of our reports recently, shorter reports. they're all different. You know, they have different power systems. In fact, the New Haven actually is a little more dense because it actually can switch from third rail, which is, in other words, there's a third rail running alongside the two rails that you think of with a railroad. And that provides the electricity to the train as it's coming along. It picks up that electricity off that third rail. The New Haven can switch back and forth. But the others, they're this, they're that. And at the center of it all, coming into and out of Penn Central and so on and so forth, none of these stations are through railroads, right? Each one of them dead ends basically at Penn Central, and has got to be turned around and go back, right? Which is one of the things that could actually increase the efficiency if you standardize this whole process, standardize these systems. Go on to the next. The R32 cars, the oldest in daily operation in the world. Okay? Continuous operation in the world.
What is the age? How old are they?
53.
53 years old. There you have it from a New Yorker. Okay. All right. Another kind of train. Anyway, these are subway trains now, but it's just to give you an idea of what you've got as a mess of spaghetti, and this is, of course, then what happens.
This is an example of a breakdown in the
Raging equipment, yeah,
Raging equipment.
yeah.
Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, you get operator error. You get operators who are, fiddling with their cell phones or whatever, texting. I mean, you get this stuff. So, but this is, you don't have the kind of safety systems built in that you would with a modern system, or modern systems, plural. On to the next. This is another, we're switching now, we're going to the Hudson River side very briefly here. This is what's called PATH. That's, if I can find it real quick here, I can be reminded of the acronym. Port Authority Trans-Hudson, PATH. It's run by the Port Authorities of New York and New Jersey. That's a single port authority. Integrated port. But again, this is another one of the agencies you're dealing with. None of these guys just do what you think they're doing. They're also running their own tunnels, their own systems otherwise. So look at this. The construction of this began in 1873. Okay, by a guy named DeWitt Clinton Haskin. Interestingly enough. It wasn't completed until 1904, 1905. And so it's been running continuously. It's actually 4 tunnels. And this serves the very southern end of Manhattan from New Jersey. Go on to the next. This just gives you an idea. Here's the World Trade Center, which is where it comes into. They've just built a new $4 billion station there at the World Trade Center for the PATH system. But of course, the tunnel is 100 years old. Real, very nice glass, exotic station there. It looks like a bird. You can look it up. It's called the Hub, but the tunnels are 100 years old.
Makes sense because it's from Wall Street.
Yeah. Nice dining experience, I'm sure. And so on and so forth there. Go on to the next. Now, you have the Hudson tunnels. That's one of the 2 articles I handed out, right? I mentioned earlier the breakdowns under the Hudson River. Now these were built 100 years ago plus, and they were driven through mud, underwater through mud. They had to drive through these casings. Maybe you can go on to the next. Yeah, there. Okay, that's an example. The full-size section tunnels under North and East rivers. Just to give you an idea, that these are.
Where's the North River?
Well, that's the Hudson. Manhattan is actually turned, so sometimes they refer to it as the East River and the North River, but there may be some fine-tuning on the terminology as I understand it, but that's basically what it is. So just to give you an idea of what they were driving through the mud underneath the river, 30 feet under the river, to construct the North Tunnels. Go on to the next. So those tunnels, you know, you have these breakdowns. It's not just breakdowns. Amtrak has declared that within 20 years they have to close those tunnels. They just have to close them, what are called the Hudson River tunnels. They're just going to have to be closed because they're no longer safe. All right? So the plan was to build a tunnel. Go back a couple. This is I think this, if I have it right. Oh no, well this is a revamped version. They're proposing to now revamp the path system with a new is this both? Yeah, this is both. The new North River Tunnel and then you have a path coming in here below it. Go on to the next. Go on to, yeah. These are, Chris Christie stopped the building of a new Hudson River Tunnel system. He just pulled the plug. It was 95% funded, and he pulled the plug from his end, from New Jersey's end, and sank the system. It would have been completed roughly by now.
Wow. What was his motive?
Go back one.
Too much money. Saving money. He's trying to be a budget hawk. Don't spend the money. Cuomo's no different. I mean, none of these guys, you know, nobody wants to spend the money. Nobody has the money. We'll come back to that in a minute.
So they redirected the 95% that had already paid to another.
Well, no, part of it was federal money. Part of it was transit authority money. You know, in other words, other people had come in, right? And New Jersey was expected to come in with, you know, a portion, and they pulled out. So now now you have well, this is the one that was canceled by them. Go ahead. Now this is the new one, virtually the same, which is now being proposed. But of course, the money isn't decided because you have all these competing agencies, and they're starting all over from scratch. But it would bring it into Penn Central, you know, from New Jersey, a new system called the Gateway Project, which is supported in name by lots of congressmen and senators and so on and so forth. But now it's a question of money, and the Trump budget, at least as stated so far, doesn't have any money for this. Go ahead. This is where the tunnels, the Hudson River tunnels, come into Penn Central. Again, I just give you a sense of the immensity of what we're talking about. We're not talking about a couple little choo-choo trains. Right? Go ahead to the next. And that Gateway Project would build out this new station, which is now the Farley Post Office. Is a new facility. Oh, I'm sorry, that's over here, Farley Station, over on this side. But this would also build out this addition, Farley Post Office. But this would also, that's a big glossy, the Monahan Station is supposed to become. It's, again, another one of these wing days. But here would become, for the Gateway Project, the new entrance points for the New Jersey Transit trains coming in. But again, you get the sense of the complexity of Penn Central. Go on. More or less the same. Well, here, Hudson Yards. That's what you saw in that photograph. This is the Hudson Yards where the trains come in, which will need to be expanded. Go ahead. Another of the same, just more of a schematic of the same thing. Go ahead, just pass that one over. And just briefly on the New York water system, it's been mentioned, but you have basically two sources of water into Manhattan proper, and they're both on through tunnels, which again are over 100 years old, and they're afraid to even close either of the tunnels because they have gates on them that could be closed. As part of the cleaning process, right? Closing off the water, yeah, so the water can be drained out and clean. But they're afraid to close the gates on the tunnels because they're afraid they wouldn't open again. So the very water system limited to two aqueducts, primarily the Croton and the Catskill. Those are the two primary ones. The Delaware comes down on the other side through Queens and Brooklyn. are in critical shape. So we're not, well, we're talking about transportation here. It's more than just transportation that we've got to deal with. Now, to come back to the financial side of this very briefly, you can go back to one of the other, just put it on one of the other that's more interesting. Find one that's interesting, Mike. That's what I'm talking. It's your choice. The financial side. Now, just keep in mind that the New Jersey Transportation Trust Fund, anyway, the New Jersey Transport System, New Jersey Transit, they make about $1.2 billion a year. That's what their expenses are. There's no extra money. The MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority of New York City itself, has $35 billion in debt. So, when you look at, you'll actually look at what's an Amtrak. I mean, everybody knows Amtrak doesn't have any money. They're going from year to year.
So sold off parts of its commuter route.
Yeah, right. Good point. So unless there's an entirely different approach, you can't even finance the maintenance of the existing system. Further, and these are important points that Jason Ross makes at the end of his paper. I'll just mention a couple of them quickly here. First of all, the most densely populated areas of today may not be the most important areas in the future. For example, I'm just quoting from Jason, the emphasis on connectivity to Midtown Manhattan. We saw those pictures, yeah, there. Midtown is basically right in here, right? Into Midtown Manhattan exists because of past investments. In other words, because the infrastructure exists, it has existed for 100 years, to get in from New Jersey and from across the East River into Manhattan, that makes Manhattan function, right? And people come because it can be a center of activity. So new infrastructure can make new centers. And if you watched the webcast last night on LaRouche Pact, that was a point that was being made by Jason in a different way. With maglev train systems, for example, replacing, say, what Amtrak has now, because of their speed, 300 plus miles an hour, you've got to have straighter lines. You can't be kind of, moving all around, right? You got to have straight lines. So you're going to have to build trains where a lot of the obstructions that currently exist, not just the old rail systems, but buildings, cities, towns, whatever, you're going to have to define new routes, and those new routes will then define new centers of the population. Right? In other words, you've got to be looking 100 years out. What's the greater New York area going to look like, or should look like, 100 years from now? And define from that standpoint what has to be built in terms of a new infrastructure. In other words, if you take this piecemeal, what I was just going through, to give you a kind of more of hopefully a grounding in terms of what they're dealing with there. And that great, remember, this is 10 plus million people, right? This is the New York and New Jersey Port Authority, handles 30% of the cargo coming into in and out of the United States. I mean, this is major, right? So, okay, so you got this stuff falling apart, right? This crumbling infrastructure, you're going to have to rebuild it from the top down. And that's, again, comes back, you can see, and if you saw Jason last night, he was very impassioned, that you've got to have this top-down approach. You've got to bring in the Chinese. First of all, the U.S. doesn't know how to build high-speed rail. We don't have it. So we're going to have to bring them in. Collaboratively, we got to bring them in. We're going to have to design a system from the top down, the way the Chinese have been doing it, to build out entire subway systems and interlinking cities. They've been doing it. They're on the top of the game, right? So So this kind of collaboration is absolutely essential. The national bank, infrastructure bank type funding is the other side of this, because we're going to have to reconceptualize the entire approach. The entire metropolitan area of New York is 20 million people. How many people will it have 100 years from now? So what are you building for? What are we planning for? You know, other things, other dynamics can shift. If you have maglev, if you have high-speed rail, well, the pressure is taken off the airports, right? The whole crunch around LaGuardia, JFK, Newark, you know, as Jason said, can become a breeze getting in and out of the airports if you build out high-speed rail. All of these kind of things shift.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'd be curious also to know about the amount of energy saved. Will there be implications in terms of pollution, like less pollution? You know what I mean?
I mean, oh yeah. I mean, I'd be guesstimating, but sure, there will be less pollution if you have an efficient systems or system.
That's not necessarily what the Chinese, you know, one of the byproducts that they were doing this for. It was more.
Yeah, to deal with pollution. Sure, mm-hmm. they were moving to mass transit, mm-hmm. intermodal systems to reduce pollution. They're still working on it. Sure, absolutely. It's the biggest market for electric cars in the world is now China.
Wow.
Right? Just as another, you know, example. You know, right? Yeah, replace bicycles. Yeah. You know, you could also, I mean, think about it. If you go to that map you're looking that I handed out, right? Well, there's Manhattan, but you could come down on the other side of the East River, right? With what's called the Triborough MTA line, right? That comes down from the Bronx through the Queens and Brooklyn, right? You could transform that entire part of New York. Manhattan is not New York, right? New York is much bigger than that. That's something that's been being kicked around. I mentioned more practically these through lines. You know, it's been proposed not just by ourselves or by Dr. Cooper, Hal Cooper. You know, that, as I said, to make these through lines like the path rail that comes in and needs to be replaced. The tunnels for the path railroad. That path system could not just stop at the lower end of Manhattan, but could go on through to into Brooklyn, right, and link up with the Long Island Railroad and so on and so forth, right? Other systems could be organized that also it's being proposed by Hal Cooper, among others, that you link Penn Central and Grand Central Station. And then as a result, you could do on through to the Long Island, through the L train, and so on and so forth to the other side. These are shorter term projects, but you could unclog the arteries. You know, the example was given as of a quintuple bypass. You could unclog this thing with these kind of throughputs in terms of transportation. So that's some of what, you know, what's in the works and what's being discussed. And I hope that, you know, kind of opens, you know, some eyes and, you know, a fresh look at what's going on. It's not, we're not proposing a specific set of solutions. Specific short-term solutions are being proposed. But in terms of a top-down approach, which is required, that's what's got to come into focus. Has to become the new kind of approach, which I think is what Linda LaRouche wants to come out of the creation of this committee on infrastructure for New York. So I'll stop there.
It puts a fine point on what China has actually accomplished to date. You know, I mean, this is enormous what you're describing here, but you know, they started with the huge dam project, you know, and moved on to
the Three Gorges dam.
It's unbelievable. You know, and to imagine that happening here and the kinds of transformation it means, even just to start with New York, what it would mean for the whole country.
Yeah, the whole country would be watching this,
Yeah.
right? Or should be watching it.
Well, it has to be a national project. It can't be a New York project. or-
Well, it would never, it can't function.
Yeah.
You know, the figures on the MTA and so forth, they're broke. You know, there's no there. It's got to come from outside. It's got to be a decision made. It's like deciding that we had to move to, that we couldn't let California simply dry up and blow away. You know, that there had to be a national approach to saving the California economy. You know, looking back at the the drought period and so forth. You know, and California is still wrestling with it. These are, you know, like the question of the Oroville Dam. These are, you know, these are national questions, national issues, not just local. I'm just agreeing.
And, you know,
Yeah,
Brian,
Marcia. Yeah.
It was announced today, Keisha actually intercepted this, where 59 and 610 are being shut down over the weekend,
Mm-hmm.
the ramp, because they found, I guess, crumbling of the.
But then they lost a car down a hole.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. So that it for those listening should think about, this is not just, you know, New York's problem. It's everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knows it. But mostly, I think people are afraid to think about it because they think it cannot be approached. It's too big. You know, even just here for Houston. But then if you think, oh, well, we have an overall plan nationally, and China did it. China did it in China. So I just thought I'd add that so people don't
Oh,
think
yeah.
it's just a local
No,
problem.
yeah.
Don't be on the other
No,
side.
Houston happens to be the city with the second largest number of commuters coming into the city every day,
Right.
which is about 400,000. I don't know, maybe it's 450,000 now, but it's the second largest in the country.
Second to New York?
Yeah, second to New York.
Wow.
And they're all coming in four-wheel vehicles.
And they all go.
If they're not, if not 18.
Right.
So,
And they were saying when that hole appeared in the ramp last week, they did another temporary patch on it. But they're saying that whole ramp needs to be pulled down and redone
Wow.
because it is that old. and that out.
Which intersection is it?
610.
Which one?
59 and 610.
On the southwest, like going north, is on the south.
Yeah. 610 Westwood going north onto 59.
Keisha was just trying to drive through it.
Both are closed. Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, they
South
closed the
and the
whole thing.
northbound.
Yeah, they closed the whole thing.
Wow.
Because there was a hole in it that was literally this big, you could look down through the pavement to the road below. It was that bad.
Wow.
They had to close off 2 of the 3 lanes in order to just put the patch on.
so we gotta break this coup attempt, but then obviously we gotta break the stranglehold of free market economics, you know, on the president and economic policy coming on a national level. You know, Glass-Steagall in that context is absolutely a driver on this whole situation.
Right.
Well, yeah, Joel.
To go back to a previous platform 100 years ago,
Uh-huh.
the reason why they put the subways in is because most of the transport was by horse-drawn carriages, cars. And each horse, they had something like 500,000 horses. And
500,000 horses in Manhattan.
each horse puts out 50 pounds of shit.
50 pounds of manure a day, each horse.
So they were swept up by pollution.
So-
No joke.
And when it dried up, it would all grow. The electric subway.
All right, okay. Time for another platform.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I deliberately didn't watch any news all week long because I
They
can't.
want the coma.
Yeah, everything was Comey. So, all I heard was that Glass-Steagall didn't get put on the, agenda. And that other thing that takes part, the freight dodgeball.
Yeah, the Henseling HR 10 passed the House.
It did pass the House. It's still sitting in the Senate.
Yeah.
It's gonna get passed there.
Right. And what it's done, partly because it's not expected the Senate is going to pass it, is that it brings forward the issue again of what's required, because Dodd-Frank isn't working. This HR Bill 10 isn't going to fly in the Senate because it's just a piece of, it's going back to Alan Greenspan. It's going back to the Big Bang in London back, 2 decades ago, to just go back to pure speculation, uncontrolled, unregulated speculation entirely. So the issue of Glass-Steagall is now even more front and center. You have the Nomi Prinz articles, you have Paul Craig Roberts. You have other people speaking out and saying Glass-Steagall. And the members that are sponsoring Glass-Steagall, HR 790, particularly Marcy Kaptur and Walter Jones, but also Tulsi Gabbard, are taking this they've taken it to the floor. On Friday, there was a vote on the floor on HR 10, and they rose to speak on Glass-Steagall. And now they're planning further action in the House, hearings and so forth, discussion processes. Nomi Prinz is going to be up there, continuing to be up there. We're up there. And so we really have an initiative going on Glass-Steagall.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. This is the first time in this century that Glass-Steagall was mentioned in the U.S. Congress. Even though we've had a bill in the Congress for 6 years.
With 50, 60 sponsors, 70 sponsors.
Not been one spoken word about it until
during the session.
Yeah, I mean, in an official congressional body, whether it was the Rules Committee or the House of Representatives, Glass-Steagall was discussed this week.
They could have done it before now, but they're now doing it.
Yeah, our friends are taking our strategy, more seriously, that they've got to not just introduce it, but they've got to actually go out and organize for it.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing next week. On the Wednesday, they're going to have a hearing, which is not going to be an official committee hearing or something.
Mm-hmm.
But Walter Jones and Marcy Kaptur have scheduled a discussion in one of the congressional meeting rooms, with Nomi Prinz, who was with us.
Mm-hmm.
They are lobbying for Glass-Steagall,
Mm-hmm.
to have a discussion once again in the Congress.
Yeah, I didn't mention because I didn't know if it was public to him.
It was in Paul Craig Roberts' article.
Oh, okay. Okay. He made it public. All right. Also, there was just a minute. I mean, this is bipartisan. There was this letter, right, that was just written from Ohio Democrats, Marcy Kaptur, Tim Ryan, right, who ran for the speakership, Marcia Fudge, and Joyce Beatty, commending Trump's efforts to invest in American infrastructure, his visit to Ohio, underscoring the need for the rebuilding of the waterways, right? And mentioning, of course, the Sioux locks and so on and so forth, but saying we want to work with you on this. And that's really, it's part of a
bipartisan group.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me about the webcast last night, maybe you can elaborate this because not everybody watched it, was the idea of Eisenhower's funding source for the national highways and how that evolved, how that it was conceived. Because here you have a Republican president.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was a Republican Congress, but it was entirely different politics back then.
Mm-hmm.
Creating a capital budget with a dedicated tax, which is, who can imagine Republicans creating a national tax to build infrastructure? But that's what happened in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could develop the importance of
Well, it was the highway. I was just digging through my notes. Highway Act of 1956. Mm-hmm. You remember the story, I'm sure. As a soldier, Eisenhower was part of a group. Well, group isn't the right word. It was an actual deployment of sending a fairly large military unit across the country, and including with tanks and so on and so forth. And they did it. I think it was in something less than 2 months. But
This was 1920s or something like that?
No, later than that. 1930s. Okay, I'll take that. Anyway, so bridges were breaking underneath the weight of some of the equipment. I mean, and so this is understood to be part of the backdrop for what Eisenhower, as president of the United States after World War II, decided, which was to build out 41,000 miles of highway linking the United States, the so-called numbered highway system, numbered interstate highway system. Numbered in the sense that all these, as you know, these highways are numbered.
A lot of four-lane highways before that.
No. So, most of it was built out in 15 years. A large part of it within 10. That was the actual, I think, original idea was to do it in 10. Most of it was built out in 15. It wasn't finished actually until several years later. But no tollways. That was a big deal. No tollways, and you had the setting up of the Highway Trust Fund through this bill, the 1956 bill, and that was money, as Jason mentioned last night. That's the gas tax we all know of, which hasn't been increased in decades, and also tax on tires, truck tires, and trucks, truck tariffs, if you will, and that's what's funded and maintained the federal highway system, which is actually maintained through the states, but the funds come from the federal highway system, from the trust fund. So I mean but it's an example of what top down can be done. People were moved, thousands of people were moved.
That was really interesting. 15,000 a year, and you think about that because today. Remember when they were talking about building the maglev in Texas, and they mobilized all these people against it because of their property rights. I'm not going to have a maglev going across my ranch, right? And but this idea of conceiving of the future, right?
Right, and a national mission.
Yeah.
A national mission.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see coming out of World War II, the country. Still had this conception of a national, of national missions, targets.
They used eminent domain.
Yeah, they used eminent domain. That was understood. It was accepted. These are what you got to do to move the country forward. We did it in healthcare. We did it with the highway system. We did it in a different way with civil rights. It was another expression of that optimism, as you know. Yeah, Peter.
I mean, it also brings up in a very big way the question of national banking. Because if you just think for a minute about all the debt that's hanging out on every municipality, every state, say nothing of the private corporations, which are now, head over heels in debt, the whole thing is going to have to be restructured. And you have to have a mechanism through which you can convert that debt into the kind of bonds that Alexander Hamilton did, where he said, look, you're holding a bunch of debt that's not being paid. Well, use your debt to purchase shares of our bank, and we'll pay you, 4% or 6% or whatever.
Yeah.
And
and that's also the question, as maybe you were going to, but the revenue stream. Eisenhower established a revenue stream, for the Highway Trust Fund, just as Alexander Hamilton did for that refinancing of all this debt. In terms of the tax on whiskey, imported liquor, and so on and so forth. A revenue stream that made it function.
Maybe the way this one would work is that when the Chinese and the Japanese start doing that, Texans are going to say, hey, move over, we want to do that.
Maybe so. You would hope so. Yes, it should be so. We got the astronauts to the new crowd of astronauts, the new class of that's just been named. Including some Texans. So, again, we should build on that.
Well, I was just going to say, along that line, I was looking up, I was provoked by Jason's presentation last night because he said we have no capacity in the United States to build high-speed rail. And I remember reading about this, the GE locomotive plant in Fort Worth that had all been built in this modern capacity, and they were building locomotives for China and 50 countries around the world. And so I thought, well, maybe this is a capacity, that could be upgraded to be able to build high-speed rail. But anyway, when I opened up the latest news releases that they just laid off 250 out of their 750 workforce. I mean, this is, maybe Donald Trump needs to go to Fort Worth and say, we're going to have, and they were promoting, they had in March or something, a promo for, that was posted among these press releases, for a tour. They're trying to recruit financing for the plant, right? And an investor tour of the plant, and then a cocktail party afterwards and so forth. But, they're trying to drum up financing. But, this is, anyway, I'm just saying.
Yeah, without a national bank, without a national infrastructure bank, national bank credit generating process, the capital doesn't exist. Right.
Yeah. If you think about Fort Worth, that whole area and the mid cities, they have, Bell Helicopter, they've got the aerospace, they've got,
brand new toll roads.
Yeah, I'm saying we have capacity. We've just got to totally transform it and bring in a workforce, start training a workforce to do this.
Well, that's one of the ideas that's under discussion in New York, is to actually use New York as kind of a pilot project.
Right.
Where we would bring in, we would use American labor, we would have training for young people, young Americans with Chinese advisors, so that we're actually building a pilot project to build up capabilities that we don't have right now.
The CIC, it comes back, this is not, maybe it's a useful point to just underscore, this is not abstract. The Chinese Investment Corporation is the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, is relocated its offices to New York City, right, from Toronto. And they're interested, and other people that we're in dialogue with, Chinese, specialists and so forth, are interested in exactly, what we're discussing here. So this is not purely a hypothetical or discussion. It's something that's being hammered out, shall we say.
It just came to mind also that a labor pool that we could be heavily drawn on is, former military young people, who had participated in various engineering things that were necessary in their deployment, that would be ready to learn a useful skill.
Sure. And in that regard, the Army Corps of Engineers comes to mind too. But not to detract from what you're saying. Also the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of capabilities, which are, they're heavily underfunded and underutilized, but they could be geared up.
Sure.
Well, we'll stop there. Go ahead.